Okay, so the next big deal was the Quartering Act and the Stamp Act of 1765. This Quartering Act was a big deal. If you've ever watched the series Turn on AMC, I believe, it's all about the revolution out on Long Island, and they're having to quarter British troops. Now, they didn't have to quarter them everywhere, just where they were, where housing was short, where in short supply. So what they would do is, if you were a colonist and the British soldiers came in and they needed a place to stay, you would have to let them have your bedroom. You would have to feed them, wash their clothes, and take care of them in general. And so that's very invasive. I mean, you think about how we would like to have some strange man or woman living in our house that we don't know, just because the government says we have to let them. So that was a very big bone of contention. Grimble thinks that this is perfectly reasonable, no big deal. The one that affected, and that thing is what you have to also remember is that all of these acts did not affect everybody. So everybody was not so outraged about the Quartering Act, only the people that it affected at the moment. Stamp Act, it affected everybody. And that is part of the problem. The reason that this Stamp Act was so offensive was that everybody felt the pain of this. It was meant to raise money for a new military force. It said that you had to have stamped paper, or you had to put stamps on everything, every piece of paper that you used. And that affects everybody, because everybody has to deal with marriage licenses, commercial and legal documents, diplomas, pamphlets, newspapers, playing cards. And that's just the start. So the Stamp Act affected everybody, and that's one reason there was such mass uprising against this particular tax. So you had the Stamp Act Congress. The colonials get together and they have a Stamp Act Congress in New York in October of 1765, and they're going to write a letter, and they're going to discuss all that's that their grievances about this. This is the text of the letter, and the thing is that you don't have to read the whole thing, but the point in this, me including this in the slide, is that you have to see that their mindset was not independence. They were not trying to be rude, hateful, disrespectful, or anything like that. If you read this letter, these people were not in an independent sort of mind. The members of this Congress, sincerely devoted with the warmest sentiments of affection and duty to His Majesty's person and government. Okay? So that's a pretty good deal. They're not being rude. Inviolably attached to the present happy establishment of the Protestant succession. So they're happy that His Majesty's a Protestant, blah, 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 blah. Then you have declarations of our humble opinion respecting the most essential rights and liberties of the colonists and of the grievances. And then you have British subjects in these colonies. People were not thinking about themselves as Americans. They were thinking about themselves as subjects of the king. Indispensable duty of these colonies to the best of sovereigns. So he's a great king. To the mother country. We love the mother country. And to themselves, to endeavor and by a loyal and dutiful address to His Majesty. We're writing you this letter because we want you to consider this. Humble applications to both houses of Parliament. Humble applications to procure the repeal of the act for granting and applying certain stamp duties. Okay, so these people were not being radical or rude at all. So that is an erroneous comment or attitude of the British, that they were being radical. Then you had the Declaratory Act of 1766, which just says, okay, the king and Parliament are in charge. The Townshend Revenue Act, they tax oil, glass, lead, paper, tea. And the thing is they do all of this, and it only generates a revenue of £40,000 a year. These British are not getting rich. What they're doing is they're really ticking off the colonists with these continuous, all these different taxes that they're enacting. And so the taxes that they're enacting are not generating that much money, but they are making the colonists very mad. And so it's like, how smart is it for £40,000 a year? How smart is that to irk the colonists when, you're not making that much money off of it? So they got crazy, like I was telling you about John Hancock. This is an image of John Hancock, and this is an image of his ship, one of his ships. They impounded one of John Hancock's ships, and so the mobs attacked the customs house in defense of John Hancock. You have troops occupying Boston by late 1768. Nobody says anything, but they have non-importation agreements. So the colonists are boycotting. They're going to hit the British where it hurts in their pocketbooks. And so that is a wise move. They're not being violent. They're just not purchasing British goods. So they think they're going to hurt the British through their pocketbooks, which they do in a big way. They want the British to understand that they are a significant force to be reckoned with economically. If they don't have the colonists as a market, then the British merchants lose lots and lots of money. Well, what happens when the British merchants lose money? They go to the Parliament and say, you got to repeal this tax so these guys will start shopping with us again because we're losing money. So the British merchants put pressure on Parliament to repeal the different taxes. And so the non-importation agreements do make a difference. So you have the Boston Massacre. This is an image of Crispus Attucks. He was a former slave, and he was the first man killed in the violence that became the Revolution. This Boston Massacre, the people in Boston were mad about the Townshend duties. And so on March 5th, 1770, you had this mob of about 60 people at the customs house, and the British bring in some of their soldiers that are occupying Britain, Boston. So you have all of this chaos that ensues. Now this is an image of Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. This is image is basically propaganda, and it is circulated throughout the colonies, which just antagonizes all the colonists because they don't realize that this is not accurate. This shows that you've got a bunch of innocent citizens, and you've got a bunch of horrible, hateful soldiers, and you've got this officer out here telling them to fire on these mob of innocent people. You've got these guys lying down here bleeding and all. In fact, what happened was the colonists were throwing snowballs with rocks in them and things like that, and they were antagonizing them, yelling at them to fire on them. And so finally somebody, and we don't know who it was even to this day, if it was the colonists or if it was the British troops, somebody fired and things go south from there. So this is one of those images like we were talking about at the beginning of the term that proves that images shape opinion in a big way. If you'll notice too, all of this gun smoke is huge with the gunpowder, and they had to, with the muskets, they had to light the gunpowder on fire. So by the time you had a couple of volleys going on, you couldn't see who you were firing at because there was so much gun smoke. So they have a partial repeal of the Townshend Acts, but they still tax tea and sugar. Well, tea was huge in the colonies because coffee will become the big drink in the colonies as a result of their boycott of English tea. But their preferred drink is tea, of course. So the British East India Company was on the brink of financial ruin. So Lord North, the finance minister, decides he's going to prop up the British East India Company with his government position. Of course, he's going to prop up a private company, which is, corrupt beyond belief. He's going to help the British East India Company and he's going to tax these colonists, but they're going to charge lower prices. So he thinks the colonists will be happy because they're going to have cheaper tea, and they'll pay the tax, so no big deal. Well, he underestimates. So they have boycotts on this tea tax, and they have threat of violence all up and down the eastern seaboard. Well, 3 ships come into Boston Harbor to offload their tea from the British East India Company, and they have this tea party, December 16th, 1773. They did 700, in today's money, they would have done $750,000 in damage, which is a big deal. They were disguised as Native Americans, and they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. As a result, the British government punishes the Bostonians. They have, and these intolerable acts, they're known as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies. In Britain, they're known as the Coercive Acts. It's a series of 5 acts enacted to punish the Bostonians for the Boston Tea Party. So you have the Quebec Act, which recognizes Catholic Church as the official church in Quebec, which angers the Puritan Congregationalists in New England. The Massachusetts Government Act says that they're going to have to clamp down on the laws in New England. The Administration of Justice Act is the impartial punishment of laws executed in riot situation. Port Act that closed Boston Harbor until the tea is paid for. But the question is this: if they're not doing business, how are they going to make any money to pay the tea tax, to pay back for the tea? So the First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in 1774, and they issue the Declaration and Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves are a series of resolutions that urge these Americans to refuse obedience to the new laws, to withhold their taxes, and to prepare for war. The Continental Congress coordinates this resistance in Philadelphia with leaders of 12 different colonies. They have a Continental Association, and they have committees of safety. In 1774, October, Continental Congress endorses the Suffolk Resolves and adopts the Continental Association. This Continental Association also coordinates the Non-Importation Agreements, and they say we're not going to trade with Great Britain or the West Indies because the West Indies are British colonies. So we're not trading with these people anymore. Well, that causes the American colonists to have to begin making their own fabric, providing their own, making sure they have all their food. They have to start making things that they haven't had to make before, which changes the fashion, which is a whole other story. But anyway, the committees of safety, authorized by Congress to oversee these mandates and to make sure that the enemies of American liberty, meaning the merchants, were not secretly importing British goods. So they wanted to make sure that everybody was adhering to this non-importation agreement. So in 1775, you have 7,000 men, these local committees. You have small farmers, artisans, laborers, who had before now had little role in government, and they had not exercised their political power, meaning they didn't vote. Now suddenly people are talking. Everybody's talking about politics all of a sudden. Okay, so also need to talk about the non-importation agreements. Because the fabrics, all the women's dresses until this point had been made of silks and fine fabrics sent from Britain. Well, now suddenly it becomes fashionable to wear cotton, linen, homespun fabric that they can make here in the colonies, because that is a patriotic thing to do. It's a patriotic thing to wear. It would have been considered out of style, and poor women would have worn it only to wear the cotton dresses and those kinds of things. Suddenly, wearing cotton dresses is totally fashionable because they're standing up for their political rights and it's their statement. And so women have a very big part in the non-importation agreement success, because they're the ones that are doing the shopping, and they have to not they have to agree and and practice the non-importation, that we're not going to buy goods from Great Britain anymore. So you have these militias, and you have the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is actually the Breed's Hill. It's actually called Breed's Hill, but we know it as Bunker Hill. And so in June 1775, you have all of these American colonists who are up here on the top of this hill, and you have all these British guys down here on the bottom. Now, Britain actually ends up winning this battle. However, they have many more losses than the Americans do, and so this is good for American morale. George Washington is authorized by the Continental Congress to be the commander of the Continental Forces. You also have Thomas Paine, as in Common Sense. This is just a funny image of Thomas Paine with his birthday cake. This is his pamphlet that he wrote about the American cause. And so these are the big people. Richard Henry Lee, this is him. He has a resolution for the free and independent states. These are other, obviously, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, the guys who were in Philadelphia in June 1776.